Hello students, my name is Dr. Workman and I am an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology here at UNCG. And today I'm going to talk to you about medical anthropology and resource insecurity. At the heart of it, medical anthropology is concerned with how we understand human health. That is, what makes people sick and what makes people well. From a biomedical perspective, we think of disease as a biological process. So, for example, COVID is caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And that's because we attribute it to a viral agent that fits within our biomedical understanding of disease causality. Now, cross-culturally, that might not always be the case. And so, for example, you might see human health or ill health attributed to witchcraft, for example, or to supernatural causes, or social distress. And so medical anthropologists often differentiate between disease, which is understood to be a biological process, and illness, which is the experience of disease, which relates to non-biological processes and larger cultural experiences and understandings. And when I say that health and illness are culturally constructed, what I mean by this is that different cultures have different understandings of what causes disease and ill health, how it manifests, and how it should be treated. So, for example, do you go to a doctor or to a healer? And that would be culturally specific. And just like medical anthropologists differentiate between disease and illness, they also differentiate between health and wellness. Again, because these are cultural constructs. So health can refer to an absence of disease, but well-being refers more broadly to the experience of health as holistic. So it relates not just to human biology, but to your space in your culture. So do you feel like you are being marginalized, or do you feel that you are experiencing social distress? And so when we talk about food and water insecurity, we'll see all of this come into play. So again, while medical anthropology draws on all subfields of anthropology, today I'm going to focus more on the bio side. Your textbook describes biomedical anthropology as being a subfield of biological anthropology. Because of this, it's rooted in empirical studies, hypothesis testing. It may focus, for example, on biological adaptability. And so it's really focused on the human biology side of medical anthropology. Biocultural anthropology, which is how I think of myself as a biocultural anthropologist, is a subdiscipline, and it's also a framework. So let me explain what I mean. So biological anthropology is the synthesis of cultural and biological anthropology. So I use methods and theory from both, but it's also a perspective. So if you read a paper that says, such and such disease we can understand through a biological framework. So for example, COVID. That means that health and illness is determined by biological and cultural processes. And I'll explain quite a bit more what I mean by this as we go through the slides. As I mentioned, I'd like to talk about human health and resource security. In order to do so, I would like to first define them. So this definition is the one I commonly use, and it comes from the FAO. And as you'll see, the definition explains that you need food security for human health. You have to have sufficient, safe, and nutritious foods to meet your dietary needs. But food security also means that you have the food that you prefer, and that you have food that allows you to lead an active and healthy lifestyle. So I think this really well gets at this broad understanding of well-being. Similarly, water security is also needed for human well-being. So this definition put forth by Jepson and colleagues really speaks to the fact that water security is not just having enough water. So it's not that you have only enough water to meet your needs, but that you have enough water to meet your needs for all of your opportunities and to lead a life that is full of all of your potentials. And they also mention that water security here, you can think of, again, not just as the presence or absence of a resource, but it's the set of social relations that allows people to access water as a resource. Your textbook, the chapter, makes several important linkages between human health and resource security. It mentions, for example, the epidemiological transitions that have occurred as humans throughout history have shifted in their social organization. So you see, for example, as humans settled and started farming more extensively, what's known as the agricultural transition, we see a rise in infectious diseases. And we can attribute this to several factors. One being that as people started living in urban areas or towns, you had more people living close to one another, which allows infectious agents to spread more easily. You also, over the millennia since then, have started to see class differentiation. So you see important linkages there when we start to see that lower socioeconomic groups tend to have higher rates of malnutrition, for example, which is really important, actually, as it turns out, in relation to infectious agents, which I'll speak about in a moment. The chapter also talked about the need for adequate nutrition for optimal growth and development. And so this has to do with, a mother having enough nutrition while pregnant, and children as they grow having enough nutrition to grow as best as they can. The chapter also speaks about biological plasticity. So this does also relate very much to nutrition, because you see that malnutrition, chronic malnutrition, can lead to stunting. And what we see, though, is that the children of immigrants, so you might have immigrant groups who come and as a population tend to demonstrate higher rates of stunting, that the children, when given adequate food, tend to grow taller. So there's a huge shift in height, intergenerational height, if people have access to adequate nutrition. So food and water security obviously are important, not just in childhood, but over the life course. And so you need not only macronutrients that are available in food, but micronutrients that are available in food and water. And so this has to do with biologically all the biological processes that humans have. And again, it also, you need food and water and security for biological health, but also for mental health and social health. And I'll talk about that later. So water insecurity really links to infectious disease as well. So for example, water can be contaminated with pathogens. So if you drink unsafe water, you can be exposed to enteric illnesses. You also need water security to have sufficient water for hand hygiene. So if you don't have enough water, you can't wash your hands. And that might also expose you to pathogens. You also need water to prepare foods. So if you're going to wash what you eat, you have to have clean water in order to do so. And so that's when we also start to see the linkage between food security and infectious disease. And so your foodstuffs also have to be free of pathogens. And so food is a pathway through which you can get sick with infectious diseases. And we also see that these all link, and they're all very interconnected. So for example, diarrhea is a leading cause of death for children under 5 globally. And there have been many interventions to try to stop this, because it really is a leading cause, as I mentioned. But what researchers and practitioners have found is that the reason why so many little kids who contract disease have increased morbidity and mortality is that there's a linkage within their bodies between malnutrition often and enteric disease. So if a child is malnourished and they are exposed to a pathogen, so for example, rotavirus or E. coli, they tend to have much poorer outcomes. And so offers us a framework to understand this. So an epidemic in public health, an epidemic is an extended outbreak. So an outbreak is if a few people get sick. An epidemic is when that number significantly exceeds what's expected, and often people talk about epidemics as a lot of people getting sick at once. So it's a significant increase over what's expected very quickly. Now, a syndemic differs from this. A syndemic is when you have multiple co-occurring epidemics. Now, what's important, though, in a syndemic model are several things. The first is that the diseases don't just occur in tandem, but they interact. The second important thing is that you see that there are diseases and they're clustered within certain populations. And the third thing that's important is that these diseases cluster because of the political economic environment. So to put another way, you have, for example, disparities in wealth. You might have large disparities in wealth. And within certain segments of the population, what you're going to see is more disease. And this is directly related to the fact that there are these disparities in wealth driving these biological outcomes. And so in a syndemic model, as evidenced by this picture, this figure, is that you have one disease and another disease and they interact, and what results is enhanced disease progression and negative health outcomes. So for example, tuberculosis and HIV. These tend to co-occur within populations, and if you have HIV and you contract TB or vice versa, you tend to get really, really sick. And the people often who are exposed to HIV and tuberculosis are exposed, via working conditions, for example, among minors or people who are in prison. So again, a syndemic model is different because it really speaks to the interconnection between these diseases. I have a paper forthcoming in the American Journal of Tropical Medicine and Hygiene in which I argue that we can think about water insecurity and food insecurity using a syndemic framework. So what you see are structural inequalities that drive water insecurity and food insecurity. So because of structural inequalities, people lack water. They have unsafe water, they have too much water, or they have unacceptable water. And you might think of that in terms of like intermittency. So maybe every other day you have water, or maybe it seems like not everyone in your community has equal access, and so that's creating interpersonal conflict. And you can think about food insecurity the same way. So according to the syndemic framework, what you see is a biosocial interface. So you have the social context really intersecting biologically with people to drive what they refer to, what proponents of syndemic theory refer to as bio-bio interaction. So here's where you see these intersections between malnutrition and enteropathogen exposure or chemical toxicant exposure. And as I'll describe in a slide, increased psycho-emotional and social stress and anxiety. So we can think of water insecurity and food insecurity syndemically. And I don't mean to say that water insecurity is a disease or food insecurity is a disease, but to speak back to this idea about illness and ill health as being broader than a biological process, but yet we see here that the result are these biological interactions. I conducted my research in a country called Lesotho, which is entirely surrounded by South Africa. And I was studying water insecurity in a syndemic context. And let me explain. As I mentioned in the previous slide, Lesotho is entirely surrounded by South Africa. Due to the geographical location, its history is, not surprisingly, very tied to that of South Africa, including the history of colonialism regionally. I was interested in exploring this endemic context. That is, food insecurity, water insecurity, and HIV/AIDS in the context of poverty. In order to understand how water insecurity and food insecurity and HIV/AIDS all intersect within Lesotho, it's first necessary to establish the economic context. Lesotho is considered to be one of the least developed countries in the world. It scores very low on the Human Development Index, and this has to do with its colonial history in relation to South Africa and to even Great Britain. And historically, it's been highly dependent on South Africa, particularly with mining. And what this means is that working men would leave Lesotho to go to South Africa to work in the diamond and gold mines. But over the last several decades, we've seen a tightening of the South African borders, and the result is that most Basotho men have been retrenched, and what that means is that they lost their jobs and had to return to Lesotho, where they had few economic opportunities. There is a textile industry, and the government is really committed to trying to use the textile industry to raise the country economically, although it's had pretty uneven success with that. At the time of my research, there was high unemployment. The rates vary between 35 and 45%. But what's really interesting is that water is the most pervasive natural resource. And in fact, Lesotho sells water to South Africa through the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. And it's interesting how I could say that the water is the most pervasive resource, yet people are highly water insecure. And so let's do this. First, I would like to talk about food insecurity, since food insecurity academically has a longer history of being something that's been studied and understood. And so people tend to recognize that many places in the world are extremely food insecure, Lesotho being one of them. And in the decade prior to my research, there had been a protracted drought, and I mean over like about 10 years, with some years worse off than others, and it resulted in a food crisis. And so the World Food Program actually had to deliver humanitarian aid. 80% of the diet is cereals, which obviously are lacking in important micronutrients. And you also see this lack of varied diet is having other health outcomes. And you have obesity and malnutrition common, often in the same household, which is known as the dual burden. There is a high prevalence of diabetes, and people tend to be vitamin deficient. And indeed, my quantitative findings indicate high rates of food insecurity. At the time of my research, Lesotho had the third highest prevalence in the world of HIV. It was 23.3%. It was highest among women 25 to 29 at 40%. It was known as a generalized epidemic, but there were high at-risk populations, including minors and factory workers. We also see a high degree of water insecurity in Lesotho, which may be surprising considering I just said that water is sold to South Africa. And the reason that is because the water is highly concentrated in the highlands. So in the lowlands where I was working, you actually see water scarcity in ways that you might not in the highlands. And this is driven by several processes. The first is the drought, as I mentioned. The drought was protracted and did not allow for the aquifers to recharge sufficiently. You also see a increase in the population in peri-urban areas. So the total water needs increase while the total water available stays the same or decreases, as the case may be. And you also see issues with technology. So, for example, a lot of these taps had been put in the 80s and 90s. And so several decades later, you start to see wear and tear. And so, for example, you can see in the picture with the buckets that there are several bricks missing. And as the respondent indicated in the quote above, that the tank across the street is always breaking and leaking. So what this picture is of what are referred to as jerry cans, and they are the container that women use to transport their water. So this picture is of a line of them, a queue. So women would wake up at 4 in the morning or so, go put their buckets in the queue. The tap would be turned on every other day or every few days, and each household would be allocated one bucket of water, and then they would take it home, and that was all the water that they had until the taps were opened again. Although obviously if the taps break or are far or are dry, then that really increases your water insecurity in your household and decreases the total water that you have for all of your household uses. We do also start to see some intersection between water insecurity and food insecurity. So, for example, this 69-year-old woman said, "I don't have enough paraffin to be wasting it on water." And she was referring to using paraffin to boil water. And this indicates that if you only have enough paraffin to either cook or boil water, that the choice is evident. People would choose to use the paraffin instead to cook their food, and they wouldn't boil their water. And I have a paper in the journal called Global Public Health, which talks about how many people chose to boil their water and the reasons why and why they might not. How was I going to assess whether or not there were syndemic conditions in Lesotho? I did a mixed methods study, so I conducted qualitative interviews with 56 people. I used a household water insecurity survey, which I had designed. And at the time, our understanding of water insecurity wasn't as developed as in the slide at the beginning of this presentation. And water insecurity was really understood to be comprised of 3 dimensions. So you have availability and access and usage. And so you had to have water physically available. You have to be able to access it. And you have to have enough water for your daily needs. And so I created a survey that captured these dimensions and a few others. And given that food insecurity was so prevalent in Lesotho, I had to control for it in the models. I also included base household demographics again because poverty can really drive a lot of the outcomes that I was looking at, which I will mention in a minute. My outcome variable was the Hopkins Symptoms Checklist. And it's a screener, so that means that I wasn't diagnosing, but rather screening for symptoms of psycho-emotional distress, specifically depression and anxiety. And because of ethical concerns, I did not ask anyone in their household if they were HIV positive. That's against ethics. So instead, I created a proxy measure, which was change in household demographics, which either would have indicated somebody dying recently or the addition of a family member. And that's usually an orphan or a vulnerable child entering the home because of the death of an adult child. And I did indeed see many households were comprised of grandparents and grandchildren. So what did I find? Well, I found that all 3 water variables predicted higher scores on the Hopkins. Food emerged as a notable concern qualitatively, and indeed, when asked what people's greatest stressor was, they would more often than not mention food. Indeed, 82% of the participants reported not having enough food. The HFIAS, which was the scale that I used to assess household food insecurity, indicated a high degree of it, particularly in regards to access and variety, which I had mentioned that really just substantiates what was known about the conditions in Lesotho, in that people tend to have a diet that's heavily dependent on cereals and less access to things like proteins and micronutrients from leafy greens and the like. And what really significantly stood out to me is that 80% of the respondents had lost crops because of problems with water. And to me, that really gets at this linkage about how water insecurity is just driving food insecurity in a pretty significant. There are other important intersections between food and water insecurity. However, as evidenced by this quote, you can't cook the food if you don't have the water. Water drives food insecurity not just in terms of the availability of crops and gardens, but also in terms of your daily needs. And so if you don't have water, if the taps are dry, you have no water, you can't cook your beans, for example, which is what this picture is of. And so there are other ways that it intersects, and we're going to get at that when I talk about my current and future research. In my analyses, I did do several regression models, and I think here is where we start to kind of get at what's going on between food and water insecurity and how water insecurity relates to these psycho-emotional outcomes. So what we see here is that water usage really predicted increased depression, but it could not explain any additional variance beyond food and beyond food insecurity and SES, socioeconomic status. We see that water access could not explain increased variance for anxiety or depression, but it could for the total if you sum the two subscales together. But here, the perception of safety, so this idea of whether or not that your drinking water is safe, really significantly predicted anxiety and depression, and the sum total, was able to account for additional variance in all the models. So beyond food insecurity and socioeconomic status, you have this fear of water safety really driving psycho-emotional. In conclusion, what we see is that vulnerable households were unable to respond to shocks, and so this is what happens in a syndemic context. So you have, grandmothers telling me that it comes down to either buying food or sending their child to school because their adult child had died, and now they're caring for an orphan or vulnerable child. And you have, the drought happened and people's gardens failed and they didn't have money to supplement with food. And since a lot of the food in the country is imported, it tends to be quite expensive. And so all of these together were significant in the models and drove depression and anxiety. And we see that water can explain variance in the HSCL scores beyond SES and FIS. And so what this speaks to is the importance of water security overall, because at the time of my research, people were really focused on food security. And I think that this research shows, one, the importance of water insecurity, but also in how water insecurity connects with food insecurity. And this is all really important, especially in the context of HIV. And finally, this all speaks to the importance of perceived cleanliness, which I think goes back to what I had mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, that yes, you need food and water. You need it to be nutritionally sound. You need it for optimal growth and development. You need safe food and water so that you don't have enteric illnesses, but you also need food and water security to prevent psycho-emotional distress. And so here you see that the stress of water really connects to overall well-being or lack thereof. And as this quote really indicates, there's a lot of time spent thinking about water. I have current research building on this in Morogoro, Tanzania, and Tamale, Ghana. But today I'm going to discuss the research that's in Morogoro because it's more closely aligned to what I just. In spring of 2018, I was part of a team that was developing a household water insecurity experiences scale. What this means is that at the time, a team of scholars led by Dr. Sarah Young at Northwestern were creating a household measure of water insecurity. And in order to create it and validate it, you have to administer it to a large number of households. And validating means that you determine that it is measuring what you think it's measuring in a way you want it to measure it. So at the time, we were given an older version of the scale, and I administered it to 300 households. And this was done by 28 site PIs in 23 countries. And we ended up with a total of 8,000 households assessed for water insecurity. Since then, the scale has been reduced from about 30 items down to 12, and the final version has been published. So now it's a short and sweet scale to determine household water insecurity at the household level. And in order to validate it, we also had to collect data on food insecurity and a bunch of other measures, and this is done in order to mathematically determine the relationship between specific variables. And there's all sorts of steps in order to validate a scale. And so we have, in addition to water insecurity data, we had food insecurity data, SCS data, data about water sources available, and I had also added to it a qualitative qualitative interview, which I conducted with 30 people. And to the 300 households in that assessment, I also included a sanitation assessment. Since then, many of the site PIs and the leadership team from the development of the HWISE scale have analyzed some of those data that are available in that large data set. And here you'll see that we find that household water insecurity is strongly associated with food insecurity in 27 sites in both high and middle income countries. So these connections that I saw in Lesotho really do pop up globally, and it really suggests that these relationships are really quite strong between them. As I mentioned, I added sanitation questions to the household assessment that I conducted as site PI for HWISE. And that experience and others really suggests to me that we don't have the same kind of understanding of wash insecurity that we do for food insecurity and water insecurity, and that sanitation is also very connected to food and water, believe it or not. And this particular picture is of a latrine. It's probably a pit latrine. I can't tell from here. It might be a pour flushed, which doesn't mean that it connects to sewage in the way we think of flushing, but that you would pour water into it. But you'll see that this particular latrine is a little higher, which usually is beneficial because it's less likely to flood. But what you see here is that next to the latrine, there's a bit of a ditch. And it's not included in the picture, unfortunately, but those plants that are there look like weeds, but some of them can actually be used either in cooking or medicines. And immediately next to it, there was the neighbor's house, and he was growing maize. So in the event that this latrine did experience some kind of spillover, then that ground would have been contaminated, as would have the neighbor's crops. And so my current research is how wash insecurity is manifested and what role food and water. And here are some qualitative findings that get at these relationships. So one person said to me, "I can't lie, if you leave your environment dirty and someone places food without covering it, unknowingly you cause people to get fever." And that's not untrue, because flies are a vector. So what that means is if a fly lands on human waste and then lands on your food, you can in fact get sick. So having flies around a latrine within a household can actually pose a risk. Then this also gets at the economic precarity and structural barriers that I mentioned are really in really a core part of syndemic theory in a syndemic framework is this woman said, like, I may lack a broom, soap, items for flushing, buckets for cleaning the latrine, because we just use the same bucket for bathing, for toilet cleanup. So you see here that because this person can't afford multiple buckets, that if they're not careful, that reusing the bucket might introduce risk in the household again, especially if they're water insecure and don't have the clean water necessary to clean the buckets or the soap necessary to clean the buckets. And that's also evidenced in this quote. Just like we have discussed, I may lack soap, broom, I may not have water. This is because, like today, we are supposed to get water, but up until now, there is no water in the taps. And in Tanzania, the configuration, the manifestation of water insecurity is a little different than in Lesotho, because by and large, people there have water. They don't have the kind of scarcity that you saw in Lesotho, but their risks are slightly different. They have, as I mentioned on a previous slide, what's known as intermittency. So often they have unexpected or scheduled breaks in their water service. They have a huge boom in population in the areas that I was doing these interviews. So the number of people far exceeds the available water resources. And so again, I think this all starts to suggest that we are going to see a bit of a syndemic. And I currently have an NSF grant. We just received it in spring, and we were supposed to spend the summer in Tanzania, but obviously the coronavirus pandemic had other ideas. This is a collaborative research project, so I'm the PI, and the co-PI is an engineer from North Carolina State, and then we are working with a qualitative researcher whom I've collaborated with in the past, and a vet, a faculty member in the veterinary sciences at the Sokoine University of Agriculture in Morogoro. And we're looking at several things. So we are going to assess water insecurity using the HWISE scale. We're going to assess household food insecurity. We're going to develop a more robust sanitation and security measure. Some of the health outcomes that we're interested are diarrheal incidence and prevalence, and epidemiologically those are different. Incidence is the number of new cases, prevalence is the total number of cases, and the difference between them is actually kind of significant. We're going to look at child and adult weight and height to get at nutrition, and so we're going to use some anthropometric assessments. And we're also going to look at mental health again, because I really want to get at this idea of well-being as being more broad than strictly biological, although mental health is biological, but I'm talking also about social relations here too. So like what kinds of social changes result from these co-occurring insecurities. The more empirical, quantitative, engineering side of it, natural science side of it, we're going to assess water quality from multiple sources, so drinking water source and any sources that might be used, for example, for laundry, where water is stored. So we'll test not only the tap, but also the storage container in the home. Dr. Harris, the co-PI, is going to look at whether or not there's fecal material in soil and water, and this is both human and animal. And we're also really quite interested in zoonoses. And zoonoses are diseases that jump from animals to humans. And as it turns out, coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, is a zoonotic disease. And so we're going to also do something called microbial source tracking. So in the event that we find feces in soil or water, we'll be able to determine what animal it came from. And so I think that'll get at how animals are being used. And so what's most interesting to me, at least anthropologically, is that animals are hugely important in terms of food security, but we also know that animals are important for household wealth and for social status. And so I find it interesting. So on the one hand, you have animals serving as this really important buffer to food insecurity and economic insecurity, but yet these animals might introduce pathogens and might actually put people at risk. So, our broader questions are food and water and wash insecurity syndemic in Morogoro? Or what are the relationships between these? Is water insecurity even separate from wash insecurity? Should wash insecurity include food and water and just one insecurity? So that's what I'm trying to get at, is what are the interrelationships between these stressors? And what are the drivers? So what is going on in Tanzania, historically, socially, economically, politically, that might explain the patterning of risk that we see? So again, what we might call the social determinants of health. So if you take any of my classes, you'll learn about that. But that's kind of the social structures that drive who gets sick and why and when and where. And then I'm interested in the health outcomes of these stressors. So are we going to see malnutrition and diarrheal disease, and what's the relationship between the two of them? Will we see psycho-emotional distress or social distress? So again, I'm trying to look at the totality of the relations between these. So in sum, what I hope you could take away from this is that diseases are biocultural. So again, they are the result of both biological and social processes, and the cultural and social context is really important to how we understand who gets sick and why and when and where. Also, that water insecurity drives psycho-emotional, social, and biological outcomes. And a fast way to say this is biopsychosocial. And so if you ever see that written in a paper you're reading, that just means that resource insecurities are able to affect biological, psychological, and social outcomes. And resource insecurity is determined by social relations, again, including power, gender, and class. And that there are really complicated intersections between food and water and infectious disease, as I mentioned, so that if you have malnutrition, for example, and enteric illness, you're likely to get sicker. And so that's something I'd like to explore. I have included some references here for you. They are references that I have cited on the. And with that, I'll end here and thank you. And please feel free to contact me if you have any other questions. I do teach classes on infectious diseases and WASH. So this coming spring, I'm teaching Global WASH. It's a 400 level class. And then next year, I'll either teach my pandemics class again or my anthropology of infectious disease class, which will touch on many of the themes that I've brought up today. Thank you.